Who has positive thoughts about 45Z? Who has negative thoughts about 45Z? Who has uncertain thoughts about 45Z? There we go. So it's 45Z really disrupts our current biodiesel blenders credit that has been in place since 2005. You got $1 for blending, but now we're going to have all of these carbon intensity modelings, and these carbon intensity modelings aren't really decided. They're decided by a little bit of politics and a little bit of science at the same time. And what that is creating is a lot of uncertainty for the industry, and you've seen the Department of Treasury come out with rules, not come out with rules. It's come out with pseudo rules. And that has just created a lot of problems for the people who are making all of these different fuels that are under 45Z. But every time that we see a new rule submitted under either 45Z or California's LCFS, we are seeing it go away from soy-based biofuels. The financial incentives for soy is being ticked down a little bit at a time and a little bit at a time. We're seeing environmentalists come out against row crop agriculture. They want waste feedstocks, but what's a waste feedstock? Something from China, which probably isn't. So I'm going to dive right in. What are the financial impacts of 45Z to the soybean industry? So 45Z clean fuel production credit came in. It's supposed to make an incentive for cleaner fuels. But what is a cleaner fuel? Now, soybean oil is not seen as a cleaner fuel under this policy. You see, for renewable diesel, the big boom that is supposed to be coming for soybean oil, where all of our feedstocks are supposed to go, we get 15 cents a gallon. That's down from $1. If you look at used cooking oil, 60 cents. A lot of that stuff is coming from China. There's currently a moratorium on importing used cooking oil for this program, but the Treasury Department said this moratorium's only temporary until they study it. They're gonna let it in. They get 4 times as much as us. Tallow, a lot of that is coming from Brazil. It's coming from deforested land in Brazil. It doesn't get a land use change charge, so tallow's getting 59 cents. Now, biodiesel does a little bit better for us. We get 33 cents, but you see, we're still half of what the next feedstocks are. What this policy does is it creates winners and losers in the biodiesel industry and the biomass-based diesel industry. So when we talk about the new markets with SAF, when we talk about renewable diesel and these value-added markets, we have created a policy which is looking to exempt biodiesel made from soybean oil or any of those other fuels made with soybean oil out of our market. So, okay, in a real world, what does this look like? Let's assume that we have a biodiesel plant in Illinois that's making 100 million gallons of soybean oil based biodiesel a year. There's actually a plant currently making 60-something million gallons, and they're doing an expansion. So this is a realistic chart. So up until last year, they would have gotten $100 million in credits for using your soybean oil. Today, they're going to get 33 million. Okay, you can have some climate smart ag practices in there. So it's about a 5 to 10% bump for those. How many of you guys are renters in here? How many of you are landowners? So we have mainly landowners in here. If you were a renter, Would you implement climate smart ag practices that you don't know if you're going to be able to rent the next year? It's a very tough financial situation that you have. So if you move on to the next line, the blender's credit was a refundable tax credit, just like a child care tax credit. You get it just for doing it. So it doesn't cost you any money in your future taxes going forward. So that's an additive to what that industry is getting. Now that 100 million has now turned into 121 million because that would be their corporate tax rate. However, what 45Z does is you have to sell that credit off to somebody. You can't just claim it. You don't just get it for the sake that you've used soybean oil in your biodiesel. You have to pay a penalty instead of getting that premium. So there's services for tax fees. And then there's services to sell it to someone, because the person you buy it from isn't going to buy it dollar for dollar. They want to take 10% off the top, so when they're able to claim it, they get another 10. They get a 10% profit at the end of the year. So what does that mean? This plant that wants to make 100 million gallons of biodiesel in Illinois with soybean oil exclusively, they're going to get 1/4 of what this year than what they got last year. These numbers aren't just true for other plants using other feedstocks. They're going to be able to make out with more money. All right, I talked about climate smart ag practices. American Soybean Association, they came out, they had a study talking about what's the benefit per acre if you have climate smart ag practices. All right, you're gonna use no-till and cover crop in McLean County, Illinois, getting the average yield. This is what the payment under 45Z is. $14.76 an acre, 19 cents a gallon, roughly 11 cents in the bushel, or no, 25 cents in the bushel. Is that enough to implement these climate smart ag practices for you? A cover crop's gonna be 40 bucks an acre, on the low end maybe. So you're giving the government money to participate in this market now and have lower CI beans. So when you get told that you're gonna be sharing revenue with biodiesel plants, that's not gonna be the case. It's a big lie told to farmers. A lot of industry. Soybean oil expected to continue to be used to backfill the need for renewable fuels as the production of renewable diesel grows. You're getting 15 cents for renewable diesel. The only way people are going to be buying that soybean oil under this credit is if you're selling the soybean oil that you're producing at a loss, because because they cannot make money with soybean oil. It's creating a market dynamic that is making soybean oil the feedstock of last resort. All right, what is the driver of this policy that we called indirect land use change? It's creating this separation in prices. So the official definition of indirect land use change, or often known as ILUC, has anyone in this room heard of ILUC before? No? A couple people. So it refers to, it's a political definition first off. It refers to the phenomenon where land conversion happens not directly at the point of biofuel production, but in response to the increased demand for biofuel feedstocks, which is leading to a clearing of forests and other carbon-rich areas to grow biofuels. thus displacing food production, causing additional greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere in the world. The land use change is indirect because it occurs in a different location due to market forces triggered by the biofuel demand. Unofficial definition. It's an unscientific method of carbon accounting politically motivated to eliminate soybean oil and other production agriculture products from biofuels in the United States. What this is saying, if you make fuel with your soybeans, it's going to mean that we're not going to feed the rest of the world. However, soybeans are 80% meal. That's food. If you are producing a soybean that has a profitable 20% volume of soybean oil, you're producing more food for the world. And if we're having yields that are increasing, you're then producing more fuel and food for the world to use. You know, the industry likes to use the word food and fuel. Well, soybeans are food then fuel. 80% of the soybean has to go into the food system, whether it's livestock, being fed to livestock, being fed to poultry, whether it's being used on the shelf in products. You know, and then we have a vegetable oil market that's very robust. Over a third, 40% of the soybean oil that is produced is going into vegetable oil or into the food system. So we don't have a food and fuel crisis. But indirect land use change is causing a lot of this reduction in credit because it's in the accounting system. No, so in the RFS, Renewable Fuel Standard, there's direct land use change, and it looks at directly that. But indirect land use change doesn't care. What it says is, doesn't matter what you've been doing in your land forever. It doesn't matter the fact that Illinois is growing more crops on less ground. I mean, if you want an indirect land use change penalty, it's a positive in Illinois. We're growing more and less. We're doing more with less every year. And you want to penalize us for that and give us lower CI scores and then turn that into less money? It's not good. So let's turn to California's low carbon fuel standard. Who has heard things about California's low carbon fuel standard, what they're trying to do in California? They're trying to ban soybean oil or pseudo bans of soybean oil into California. We've been told, hey, as this market of renewable diesel goes up, your soybeans are going to go up too. You're going to backfill. I know you have a little bit higher CI score, but your soybeans are going to backfill it. And it's not happening. And actually, and later on another slide, I'll show you in the RFS how this equates with the RFS and how we're losing market share. But California has decided our land use change charge is going to be more than double what that land use change charge was for 45Z tax credit. And we're going to make sure that we tighten the grip around soybean oil and other ag products, so then that way we can have electrification. And LCFS is an electrification program, especially in California. That's what it's designed to do. It's designed to electrify. And you've seen that renewable fuels have caught up in the technology to reduce carbon emissions. So right now people are using those renewable fuels, but what it really is planned to do is to suffocate the market of all liquid fuels so that the entire state is electrified. And they will continue to try and make it more and more costly to use soybean oil. So that's the first slide. You could see the decline of soybean oil price. So at first, when that renewable diesel boom hit, you could see, oh, they're using a lot of soybean oil. Well, as renewable diesel plants open, they will use soybean oil because it's the best feedstock to use. It's cleanest. You're able to calibrate your refineries. that renewable diesel refineries will blow up if they aren't calibrated right, and they need to get all those metrics right. As soon as that is done, this is a startup cost to them. They're going to start importing that used cooking oil and other feedstocks that are going to start causing them profits. When we talk about uncertainty, this is uncertainty. Now, you say, hang on a sec. These two charts, there's a tick up. There's a little bit of a tick up here in soybean oil prices. What happened there? Well, a renewable diesel plant came online that's doing 500 million gallons a year. They're using soybean oil. Not for long. They're just using that soybean oil for the moment. Okay, so the question is, does the shipping of the used cooking oil from China be taken into account into the carbon intensity score? So as there is no carbon intensity score into the creation of the used cooking oil, the preparation of the food, all of that. But as soon as it's declared used cooking oil, then the shipping does count. It is a very small portion of actual carbon intensity scoring. And that's actually something that China has found a way around. I mean, so right now, China is 75% of their soybeans that they're getting are from Brazil. 25% are from us. There's other countries in there, but that's roughly so what they're doing is they're crushing their beans. They're giving the meal to pork, and then they're gonna put some of the oil into the food and restaurant industry, and they're shipping that oil back. They're mixing it with other used cooking oil, tallow potentially from other places, palm oil from Malaysia. There's been reports of that. The European Union has said they're not going to allow they're doing a palm oil tariff of 37% because they feel that the used cooking oil is laced with palm oil. So now what this 45Z tax credit and LCFS are doing are giving a premium to China. So then that way they can use lower CI feedstocks, even though they're most likely fraudulent. And the US farmer, they're the victim. And we've been fighting that. We set off the alarm with the American Soybean Association. About 2 years of talking to the Treasury Department. Treasury Department has wised up to it a little bit. They've temporarily disallowed these imported UCO from being able to get biomass-based diesel credits, but they said they're going to let them back in at some point. And when that happens, it's going to be very tough on the industry. But they've set it up so that it will happen. You asked a very good question about about the profit margin and what needs to happen here, which kind of sets up this next slide. So if we go and we look at the renewable diesel and biodiesel carbon intensity scores, and soybean is way to the right, so it's got the highest carbon intensity score. That means that we are the first alternative renewable feedstock that's going to create a deficit. And that is the reason why our alternative fuel creates less credits. Because this biogas feedstock, this LNG, alternative jet fuel, all of those feedstocks are going, per gallon, are going to be creating a larger multiple of credits per gallon. So that is what's driving anyone who is creating a fuel to use anything but soybean oil. So what has that created? The market dynamic. And I think if you came to the growers' dinner, you saw this, it's on the table outside. From 2022 to 2024, we've lost 15% of our market share in the biomass-based diesel industry. Used cooking oil, tallow especially, a lot of that's coming from Brazil. They've all made gains. Corn oil is kind of sitting, a lot of corn oil now, I think it's looking to go into SAF. But I want to be clear, imports are a problem. But what's driving these imports? That's also a problem, and that's a bigger problem because our domestic policy is telling producers, use imports, you're gonna get more money for it. So if our domestic policy wasn't telling them to do that, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't be shipping stuff across the world. So to talk about the big lie a little bit, you know, everyone says renewable diesel, we're gonna, and SAF, and all these other fuels are coming in the market. We're gonna be using so many renewable fuels. Well, what really is the driver of renewable fuel use is the Renewable Fuel Standard, and that's set by the EPA. And both Republican and Democrat administrations, Republican have caved to big oil and have always made the renewable fuel obligations smaller and smaller and smaller, or not big enough to adjust to what the industry can do. The Democrats have caved to the environmentalists who don't want liquid fuels in existence and have made them smaller and smaller and smaller than what the capacity is for us to do. And if you look at all of these gains in the biodiesel, it's about $900 million over the last 6 years. All that's going towards renewable diesel. We are only about 15% of the renewable diesel market share in this country, soybean oil, of a 1.1 billion gallon industry. We haven't been able to participate in any of these gains because of these policies. And it's going to be exacerbated by 45Z. So here's a percentage of our renewable diesel feedstocks. It really started ramping up here in about 2018 and really in 2021 when a lot of places opened. So this is why everyone kind of believed that what they were being told, hey, biodiesel is going to continue to go up. But what happened was California's LCFS said, oh, our restrictions are tighter. You're going to create less credits. Our fuel then became less valuable. And people are saying, oh, we're backing off. We're using other things. We're going to import. We can't make a profit off of soybean oil. Our board, we went to a biodiesel plant, Canary Biofuels in California last year about this time. And we were told that they were actually using soybean oil-based biodiesel, and we were very excited to go and learn about it. This plant was sitting idle as it transitioned to using used cooking oil. Like, well, why aren't you using used cooking oil right now? Well, it's so in demand, and we're inside. Most of these renewable diesel plants are on the coast, and they're taking big shipments. So it's hard for us to get used cooking oil. Well, so you can run, why don't you use soybean oil? Oh, we can't make a profit with that anymore. We stopped. Carbon intensity with the land use change is way too much. So we're not going to be able to use it. It was eye-opening for our board members who are all in attendance. Oh. So that's what I got. I really want to open up to some questions and some answers, keep the conversation going. Andrew?
Yeah, so I think sometimes we get confused with what the word biodiesel means, and biofuels. So when I started working at ISA 7 years ago, it was easy. We just had biodiesel. Now, if you heard my talk yesterday morning, you can make biodiesel in your basement. Still true, can do it. You get a little catalyst in a big tub and you heat it up gently a little bit, and you separate the glycerin off of it, you get glycerin byproduct, you have biodiesel. In theory, we have consultants who like to say this, yet I've not seen them actually do it. In theory, you can drink it. It's a biological product. Renewable diesel is not the same. Renewable diesel is something you have to run through an oil refinery to make. When David said they're blowing up plants, well, they did that early on. About 10, 15 years ago, the industry started playing around with it. And the difference between a renewable feedstock, basically instead of cracking the hydrocarbons in crude oil, you're cracking the hydrocarbon chains in a renewable feedstock. Well, there tends to be more water in renewable feedstocks, and that water was creating higher pressure and higher steam, and that's what was causing the explosions of these plants to happen. They figured out how to deal with that, yet a lot of the places you're seeing renewable diesel plants come online, which they are oil refineries, they aren't new plants. There's only really one or two major new ground greenfield construction renewable diesel plants in the country. Diamond Green in Louisiana, and then there's a big plant out in Wyoming that's owned by Sinclair that's buying a lot of soybean oil and other feedstocks out of the Dakotas. Those are pretty much the places where it's getting made out of these products. Almost all the production of renewable diesel at older refineries in Texas, the Texas coast, and in California, those are these imported feedstocks. That's where it's going into the country and going to those places. So the other massive caveat that I have to throw out there is there's actually technically a second type of renewable diesel. And this gets to some issues we're facing here in Illinois with the oil industry. There's something called co-processed renewable diesel. Well, the oil industry, when they were figuring out how to make renewable diesel, they started putting small amounts of renewable feedstock in with crude oil and cracking those at the same time at their oil refinery. And they found that if they do that in the right volumes and at the right speed, that they can process renewable content at the same time that they're processing crude oil in much smaller volumes on the renewable side. Yet they want that fuel product that likely most of the renewable content, since it has higher water volume, burned off in the production process. They want that to be considered and treated the same as traditional renewable diesel that perhaps is made completely from 100% soybean oil or whatever the other feedstock is. But they're not the same fuel sources, and they don't want testing to prove it. So that's the little trick you're seeing the oil industry here in the upper Midwest want, is they don't want to close any of their current refineries and transition them to make renewable diesel because it's expensive and there's other challenges with it. And they need those refineries to be able to supply the transportation fleet. We're using more gasoline today than any time in history as a society. So they can't turn these plants off, and they certainly aren't going to build a new oil refinery in today's culture with the EPA and all the other challenges with doing that. Anytime you see those oil refineries in Chicago go down offline, you see a bump in gas prices in the upper Midwest. It's pretty simple, supply and demand. So all this, the oil companies want to find a way to game the system and make additional profits. That's what they're out to do. They're for-profit companies, after all. The problem is we don't want farmers to be the ones that are paying the price for their profits. And that's essentially where this industry has gotten so complicated in the last few years. It is hard to tell who is driving the profit and who's the winner and who's the loser. Unfortunately, these big oil companies and these folks have major deep pockets. There's a company called Darling Ingredients out of Texas, which is one of the primary companies bringing in these waste feedstocks. 5-10 years ago, they were buying a lot of soybean oil and selling it into the biodiesel industry into California. Well, they've changed that model dramatically, and now they've found all this waste cooking oil in China. Again, a for-profit company, it's what they do. But to David's earlier point is these policy proposals have set up this environment where we're driving, whether it's intentional or unintentional. In California, it is, make no mistake, it is intentional to drive any row crop-based biofuel and any liquid fuel out of their marketplace. They want to get to a zero liquid fuel use. That is how LCFS policies are created. That is the goal of them. That is how they work. Anybody who tells you they can create a nicer version of an LCFS has not met the EV industry and the proponents who are really aggressively looking to pass these LCFS policies around the country. In the short term, they might drive demand, but in the long term, they are electrification bills. Sir. I think that's an excellent point. Unfortunately, all biofuels have always needed, whether it's tax dollars or mandates, to come into place. Mandates is the other option that's out there to incentivize that use. The RFS is effectively a mandate. It says to the oil industry, the fuel industry in the country, it says you have to purchase these RVOs to offset these gallons you're selling out there in the marketplace. So essentially it's saying you have to buy up this content and make sure it's used in order to be able to sell your other product and content out there. So the RFS is a mandate. The tax credits, to your point, get really crazy and really goofy really quick. They have made a major difference to drive demand in these marketplaces. But you bring up an excellent point, is how do you move away from those over time? And I don't know that it's possible.
Yeah, even the industries.
Well, correct. Yep. Yeah. That is the policy outcome that California's chosen. They've doubled down and said they, in theory, the people who vote for other politicians in California have said, we like what you're doing. I don't think anybody in this room says we like what they're doing, but it's what they are doing. And I don't know, and unfortunately, California has had such an outsized impact on our entire industry over the last 5 to 10 years. I don't know how we can back it. And that's the problem with 45C coming into place, is it's bringing California-style logic to the whole country.
Just one more thing on what you said. You asked how do we convince people to use these without all the tax incentives. So some of the biggest players and buyers of these tax credits are the airlines, the railroads, and they're convinced that they should decarbonize their supply chains or their methods of transportation, but they're also have stockholders, and those stockholders are not convinced that the cost is worth it. So they are driving a lot of these being paid for lower fuels. But without a renewable fuel standard with ever increasing volumes, they're just going to pick winners and losers in the fuel industry and start changing where the fuel is. And they're not actually creating any more renewable fuels in the marketplace or decarbonizing anything. They're just the ones decarbonizing instead of using cheaper stuff and people on the road.
I have trouble with this graph, and I want to come back to it. I mean, electricity doesn't care where it comes from. It may not be financially feasible, but I can imagine making a plant that runs on biofuel and charging electric vehicles with it, right? Maybe a bad idea, but it would hopefully come down to fundamental economics as opposed to politics. So can you explain this graph to me like I'm 5, and then what it means to be on the right versus on the left, and then talk about what contributes to it the fundamental chemistry and physics underlying the given line versus the politics of it. Could you help me with this graph a bit?
Yeah, so electricity. They actually do look at where the electricity is coming from in California. So if you've got solar panels on your roof, or you're in Amazon and now you've got a whole bunch of delivery vehicles that are all running electric, and now you're either next to a biogas refiner that is seen as low carbon, or you're using solar panels, you're going to have a lower CI score than the general grid will. So they've come up and found a way to say, here's the general carbon intensity score of the entire grid. And then they've found niche ways to say, oh, you're doing more, you're using solar panels, your electricity is produced with biogas, your electricity isn't produced with coal, you're going to get a lower CI score. So yeah, and what this graph is showing is like the range in which these fuels are going from their feedstocks. So some of these have very big ranges. Some of them have very small ranges. Our renewable diesel and biodiesel have a very small range, and so does alternative jet fuel. But some of these other ones, like electrification, what it's showing is they have a lot bigger range to go to lower their CI score. And then that means that in the long term, as they kind of figure out their system, they're going to be more viable in the long term. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Well, just think an example, right? So you have a narrow one that's to the right. I'm still getting confused whether, like, at first it's bad to be to the right, right? But you almost made it sound like that you had more room to improve if you're to the right. I didn't quite understand the last bit you made.
No, if you're biogas, electricity, you've got a lot of range, so you can move farther down. Here, with biodiesel, we're stuck, and soybean oil's stuck even farther to the right. So we're going to have a lot harder time as the LCFS gets more and more stringent being able to compete.
I think one way of explaining that is we with traditional biodiesel, we have a certain cap on how much emissions we can reduce. I think that's what David is exploring, is that with that cap on that amount of emissions we can reduce at around a B20 blend, at whatever reduction per tons, metric tons that is per gallon, that is capped on that chart. And some of these other sources have potentially higher opportunity there, but we have a volume play to have in that marketplace that we're essentially being told we can't have.
Sir.
Elon Musk, who can get to Elon Musk? He's smart enough, if this is a valid argument, he's reasonable, it appears, and he's got a automatic route to Donald Trump. If you want to get something done, get to Elon.
Well, Elon does own a major electric vehicle company, so he may be somewhat hesitant to talk about using any sort of liquid fuel in that conversation.
Yeah.
And that's part of the challenge. Is it used to be simple to advocate for biofuels one way or the other. It's gotten so murky in the last few years of who benefits, where do they benefit, how do they benefit, what other players are at the table, that it gets hard to track who's on first and who's on second, and you start to go, whoa, where are we at here? And that's where 45Z has caused this complete uncertainty for us. Is it's basically a lot of folks have said, you're going to make money. Well, how much money? We don't know yet. How much is it going to cost me to make that money? We don't know yet that either. Yeah, but they've told everybody you're going to make that money, and it could happen. There are situations where that could happen, but it's beginning not to make any sense at all to anyone, and it's getting so complicated, and there's more niche industries popping up every single month and year that it becomes so much harder to advocate, whereas we know, as the soybean industry, we have a pretty consistent, stable product that we need to provide consistent long-term demand for, and we don't want to lose that.
Do you happen to see at least a short-term reprieve in the competition between the imported cooking oil from China with the tariffs that the current administration's putting up? At least a short-term reprieve?
So, yeah, semi. So with that restriction, that uncertainty has kind of moved back a little bit towards imports. With a new renewable diesel plant online that's now has to use soybean oil in the interim, that is a little bit of a reprieve. We also, kind of to talk Elon Musk a little bit, the Trump administration wants to streamline government. 45Z is so complicated. If anything, Elon Musk will say, okay, we need to streamline 45Z. We need to make these rules more clear. So that could be a potential help with this Republican tax bill, because these Republicans that are in Congress right now and Donald Trump, they're not for giving a bunch of money to China, and they're for simplification, and the American farmer put them in office. So there is potential there with as Trump gets his one big beautiful bill by Memorial Day, potentially. Mm-hmm.
They got other motives, markets.
One of them is a prospect of biodiesel. Having an expansion for biodiesel was part of it. They do have other markets too that they're looking for. So the answer is yes to both.
Yeah. And I don't know, Andrew might be, just a few years ago, I was hearing there's 2 new crushing plants that were going to be built in Iowa. Did those end up coming online, and are they, I mean, they get built and are they up and going?
Yeah, Andrew.
So we've seen crush expansion in the last 5 years. The vast majority of it is west of the Mississippi River. A little bit, we've seen Incobras up in Gilman is expanding their current facility. The folks at Marquis Energy up in Hennepin, the big ethanol plant there, are claiming they're going to build this crush plant. That has not yet happened. They're still looking at it. New crush plants, the market dynamics on that got really hard really quick. We heard from several crushers of, some interest in coming to Illinois. There's certainly a couple pockets in Illinois where we could really use a crusher. Southeastern Illinois and North Central. Those are 2 places where we have a lot of extra demand. But it's gotten very hard because the crush margin became unpredictable with some of the changes kind of happened overnight in California in their demand for soybean oil that David calls it the big lie. It kind of got exposed by the business folks who are like, whoa, we don't want to have to sit on supply. And then, of course, the really important thing about soybeans, no matter how much we talk about biofuels, no matter how much we focus on it, at the end of the day, 90% of the soybeans as they leave the fields in Illinois by volume are going to go into the food system somewhere in the world. 90%. If a soybean's 80% volume of meal and 10% oil, we use about 50-50, or actually a little under 50% for biofuels here in the U.S. domestically, and abroad, very little of our soybean oil is used for biofuels. That's all going in the food system somewhere. So we are still food producers. And I think that that's something that we really want to focus on. And biofuels is an opportunity to support demand and push prices up and drive basis up for consistent demand here in the upper Midwest. And that's why we're so focused on saving the domestic biodiesel and traditional biodiesel industry in Illinois, because it uses the oil from over 100 million bushels of beans every year. And if that demand goes away, all of a sudden the marketing options to sell those soybeans, the crushed soybeans from a crusher, gets a lot harder. Those are beans we're already crushing. If we have extra crushed beans sitting around, that means lower basis numbers, lower demand, and less impact on prices more broadly. But to answer your question more broadly, Crush has expanded domestically in the U.S., but nowhere near what the forecasts were when there was aggressive conversations about that. And a lot of the economists noted that at the time. They would say things like in a presentation, like I went to several economic forums in Kansas City from a group called Pro Exporter, which we're a member of, which does a lot of really good ag marketing and ag economic information. And some of their speakers would note, well, here's the announced capacity growth. We think it's going to be 60% of that or 40% of that. Their numbers varied at the time. So I think we're finding it somewhere in that 40% range. There has been crush expansion, but predominantly west of the Mississippi, a lot of western Iowa. You're seeing a lot more folks focusing on the Missouri River Valley and how that's happening.
So we're just a little bit over time. Any last final question? Okay. So the good thing here in Illinois is starting April 1st, our B20 law is going to keep ramping up into effect. So on April 1st, the standard gallon of diesel will have 17% biodiesel. In April 1st, 2026, it will move up to 20%, and our B20 law will be in full effect. This does not use any of those carbon intensity policies. This is something that looks straight at biodiesel as it's in RFS. So with that, we expect 40 million more gallons of biodiesel in Illinois to be sold this year, and then another 40 million gallons next year on top of that. So we are working to expand these markets in Illinois, and we're being successful in doing that. But we need to, remember that there are other policy threats that are happening on both national and state levels that we're always looking out for, because we don't want to go chasing a dollar of the farmer's money. We want to make sure that we're actually providing a return for the dollar rather than putting in bad investments to that money. Thank you.
I think now it's lunch.